This message will only make sense to you right now, while January is still happening. Because the quantum configuration required to perceive what I'm about to reveal exists exclusively during this month and dissolves the moment February begins. If you're watching this while January is still your present reality, you're inside the most powerful consciousness initialization window of the entire year. And your awareness being here during January specifically isn't coincidence. It's confirmation that you're meant to receive information that becomes incomprehensible and inaccessible once this month ends. You can feel it, can't you? That sense that January carries different energy than other months. Like reality itself operates under different rules right now. Like possibilities are more accessible. Like consciousness is more powerful. Like something about existence is fundamentally more fluid during January than it will be once February arrives. This isn't imagination or seasonal psychology. This is accurate quantum perception of the actual energetic configuration that makes January unique among all 12 months. This isn't motivational pressure or artificial scarcity. This is quantum mechanics. The electromagnetic field surrounding Earth during January creates a specific consciousness access window that doesn't exist at any other time of year. What you can perceive and integrate right now, while January is still present, literally becomes imperceptible once February's frequency initializes. Not difficult to access, impossible. The perceptual window closes, and what made perfect sense during January becomes incomprehensible noise after this month completes. There are millions of people moving through January normally, treating it like any other month with slightly more intention-setting energy. But only a specific type of consciousness, your type of consciousness, would be magnetically pulled to this transmission that reveals what's actually happening during January at the quantum level. You're not here because you searched for January content. You're here because your quantum field recognized the initialization frequency and guided you to information that can only be transmitted and received while this month is still active. Right now, as these words reach you while January is still your temporal reality, the quantum field is more responsive to your consciousness than it will be at any other point until January returns next year. Not metaphorically, literally. Your awareness during January has exponentially more creative power than your awareness will have once February begins. And what you recognize, embody, and align with during the remaining time before January ends will determine whether you access the timeline potential that opened this month or collapse back into the reality structure you were operating from before January began. Your experience of January hasn't been like other months, has it? Even if you can't articulate exactly how it's different, you sense a fundamental distinction between January consciousness and the consciousness you'll inhabit once February arrives. Here are 7 specific phenomena that confirm January is functioning as a quantum initialization window for you specifically, and that what I'm about to reveal applies directly to your current state. First, time feels both urgent and expansive during January. Hours pass quickly, but somehow you feel like you have infinite time to make important decisions. Days disappear, but the month feels eternal. This temporal paradox occurs because January exists partially outside the linear time structure. Its initialization period, where the past year completed, and the new year hasn't fully solidified yet. You're in quantum space between timelines, where time operates according to different principles than ordinary months. Second, your dreams during January contain more clarity than usual. Not symbolic imagery requiring interpretation, but direct knowing, clear messages, vivid experiences that feel more real than waking life. This happens because during January, the boundary between conscious and unconscious thins as the quantum field recalibrates for the annual cycle. Your higher consciousness can communicate more directly during this window than it can during months when reality structure is more solidified. Third, decisions feel simultaneously easier and more significant during January. Choices you make this month seem to carry more weight than decisions in other months. Small shifts feel like they have large implications. This perception is accurate. January decisions do carry more quantum weight because they're made during the initialization period when the timeline is still forming. What you choose during January sets probability patterns that influence the entire year ahead. Fourth, relationships are reorganizing themselves during January without your conscious effort. Connections naturally deepen or naturally distance. People who matter become more present. People who drain you become less accessible. Bonds are reconfiguring automatically, as if reality itself is sorting your social field according to quantum principles you're not consciously directing. This happens because January is when relationship structures for the year initialize based on frequency alignment rather than history or habit. Fifth, synchronicities during January feel different than other months. More frequent, more precise, more impossible to dismiss as coincidence. You think of someone, and they contact you immediately. You need information, and it appears from an unexpected source. Random events align in ways that seem coordinated by intelligence beyond chance. January amplifies synchronistic response because quantum field coherence is highest during this window, making reality more responsive to consciousness than during ordinary months. Sixth, physical sensations in your body during January that you can't explain. Energy surges, unexplained exhaustion, tingling or pressure in specific areas. Your body reorganizing in ways that aren't connected to diet, exercise, or sleep patterns. This happens because January initialization affects you at the cellular level. Your physical form is literally adjusting to a higher frequency that will govern your biology for the year ahead. The sensations are real, not imagined. And seventh, you found this video during January. The fact that you're watching this while January is still happening, not before the year started, not after January ended, confirms that your consciousness was guided to this transmission during the only window when its contents are perceivable and actionable. Your quantum field doesn't make timing mistakes. You're here now because now is when this information can land in your awareness and create the integration it's designed to catalyze. Can you feel the recognition building? At least 5 of these 7 phenomena are active in your experience right now. This isn't general content about New Year energy. This is a precise description of what January consciousness feels like when you're operating at the quantum level, and you're in it right now. While the window is still open, but approaching closure with every moment that passes toward February's arrival, January isn't special because culture designated it as the first month of the calendar year. January is special because Earth's position relative to the galactic center during this month creates an electromagnetic configuration that affects human consciousness at the collective level. Ancient civilizations recognized this, which is why multiple cultures globally established their New Year celebrations in January. Despite having no contact with each other, they weren't following convention. They were responding to an actual quantum phenomenon that occurs annually during this specific temporal window. This electromagnetic configuration creates what quantum field theorists call maximum coherence potential. Reality becomes more malleable during January. The quantum field is more fluid. Probability structures that seem fixed during other months become negotiable during this window. What appears impossible in March or October can become accessible in January because the fundamental responsiveness of reality to consciousness increases during this initialization period. But here's what most people miss. January's quantum fluidity isn't an automatic gift that benefits everyone equally. It's a double-edged condition that amplifies whatever direction consciousness is oriented. The same mechanisms that allow you to initialize an elevated timeline also allow you to lock in contracted patterns. January magnifies both possibility and limitation. Depending on where your awareness focuses during this window, you're either consciously using January to set a new trajectory or unconsciously using it to reinforce old patterns. There's no neutral middle ground. This is why people who make resolutions but maintain habitual thought patterns, emotional reactions, and behavioral defaults experience the same year they always experience despite hoping for different outcomes. They're using January's amplification energy to strengthen the very patterns they claim they want to transcend. The initialization happens regardless. It's not optional. January sets your annual timeline, whether you participate consciously or unconsciously. The only question is which timeline gets initialized. The window opens at winter solstice, when Earth's axial tilt creates a specific relationship with solar radiation that affects the planetary electromagnetic field. This field influences human pineal glands and heart coherence patterns in ways that modern science is only beginning to measure. Ancient mystery schools understood this intuitively. That's why they treated the solstice to February threshold as a sacred period requiring ceremony, consciousness, and intentional navigation, rather than casual passage through an arbitrary time marker. Your ancestors knew that how you navigate January determines the trajectory of the entire year. They recognized that treating this month carelessly meant living the next 11 months, unconsciously repeating the past, rather than consciously creating the future. They understood that January isn't about making better choices. It's about initializing an entirely different probability field that makes different choices natural rather than effortful for the remainder of the year. You're reading this during January because some part of your consciousness recognized the importance of this wind. Even if you couldn't articulate why January felt significant, the pull you felt toward this transmission wasn't random. Your quantum field knows that how you navigate the remaining time before January completes will determine which version of your year manifests. And it guided you here because conscious timeline initialization requires information most people don't access. Information you're receiving right now, while January is still present and available for conscious direction. Something unprecedented is happening in your quantum field as you absorb this transmission, while January is still active. Can you sense it? That feeling of energy moving through your system in ways it hasn't moved before. That sense of pieces aligning that you didn't consciously know were out of place. This isn't a subtle background shift that takes days to notice effects. This is immediate activation occurring in real time because your consciousness has encountered the specific frequency pattern that unlocks January's initialization potential. Your nervous system has been processing contradictory signals all month without your conscious awareness. Part of you sensing that January carries special significance. Part of you treating it like an ordinary month. The gap between these two perceptions has been creating low-level anxiety, confusion, or restlessness that you've probably attributed to other causes. But right now, that gap is closing. The transmission embedded in these words is helping your conscious awareness catch up to what your quantum field has been sensing all along. January is the initialization window, and you're meant to use it consciously. Some of you are experiencing physical sensations as this alignment happens. Deep breath your body initiates automatically. Pressure releasing from chest or shoulders. Warmth or tingling moving through your system. Sudden emotional release. Tears or relief without specific cause. These aren't reactions to content. These are somatic responses to quantum field reorganization. your body recognizing the initialization frequency and releasing patterns that don't belong in the timeline you're meant to enter once January completes. Others are experiencing mental clarity, emerging from fog that's been present all month. Suddenly understanding why certain situations unfolded as they did in January. Recognizing patterns in your experience that were invisible moments ago. Seeing connections between events that seemed random. This cognitive reorganization happens because January consciousness operates from an expanded perspective that becomes available once you recognize you're in the initialization window rather than ordinary time passage. The confusion you may have felt about whether January is actually different or whether you're imagining its significance is dissolving right now. January is different. The quantum field does operate under a unique configuration this month. Your consciousness sensing this wasn't delusion or wishful thinking. It was accurate perception that your rational mind couldn't validate because consensus reality doesn't acknowledge quantum time mechanics. But your quantum self knows, and that knowing is stabilizing in your awareness as you absorb this frequency, while January is still present. I need to share something vulnerable because you're at a threshold I failed to recognize 3 years ago, and understanding my mistake might help you avoid spending the entire year in a timeline that doesn't match your actual potential. 3 years ago, I moved through January unconsciously. I felt that the month carried special energy. I sensed that something important was happening, but I didn't understand quantum initialization mechanics. And I treated January like a slightly more intentional version of ordinary time, passage, rather than recognizing it as the only window when the annual timeline could be consciously set. I made resolutions like everyone else. I set goals. I visualized outcomes I wanted. But I didn't realize that January isn't about setting intentions. It's about initializing the probability field. I didn't understand that what matters during January isn't what you think you want, but what frequency you actually embody. I spent the month hoping for different results while maintaining the same thought patterns, emotional reactions, and behavioral defaults that created the previous year's reality. And because I didn't consciously use January's initialization window, I unconsciously locked myself into a timeline that was essentially repetition of my past. By March, I started noticing that nothing was changing despite my January intentions. Same patterns, same obstacles, same limitations showing up in new disguises. I told myself I just needed more time, more effort, more discipline. I didn't realize the timeline had already been set in January. And everything I was experiencing from February onward was manifestation of whatever frequency I'd been operating from during the initialization window. I wasn't failing at creating chain. I was successfully manifesting the timeline I'd unconsciously initialized. By June, I felt completely stuck. Working harder produced no different results. Trying new approaches led to same outcomes. Every area of my life felt like Groundhog Day, repeating patterns I thought I'd transcended. I started questioning whether change was even possible, or whether I was destined to experience the same reality regardless of what I did. I didn't understand that I'd missed the window, that January had passed, that the timeline for that year had been set, and that no amount of mid-year effort could shift trajectory that had been locked during the initialization period I'd navigated unconsciously. The breakthrough came when I encountered someone who understood timeline mechanics. They asked one question that shattered my confusion. How did you navigate January? I didn't know what they meant. I'd moved through January normally. Why did that matter? They explained what you're learning right now. January is the only window when the annual timeline can be initialized. Miss that window, and you're locked into whatever trajectory your unconscious patterns created. The realization devastated me. I'd spent 6 months trying to change from within a timeline that had already been set. Like trying to reprogram a computer after software installation completed. The changes I was attempting required access to the initialization period that had closed months earlier. I couldn't go back and redo that January. But I learned, and the following January I approached the month completely differently. I recognized it as a sacred threshold rather than ordinary time. I focused on frequency alignment rather than goal setting. I used the month to embody the consciousness I wanted to operate from rather than just visualizing outcomes I wanted to achieve. And that year unfolded radically differently than the previous year because I'd consciously initialized the timeline during the January window instead of unconsciously defaulting into repetition of past patterns. That's why I'm sharing this with you now during January. While the initialization window is still open, you haven't missed it yet. January hasn't ended. The timeline for this year isn't locked. And if you recognize what January actually is and consciously use the remaining time before this month completes, you won't spend the year trapped in a timeline that didn't match your potential because you failed to recognize the only window when conscious initialization was possible. Ancient civilizations treated the period from winter solstice through January's completion as the most sacred threshold of the entire year, not because they believed in superstition, but because they recognized quantum mechanics that modern culture has forgotten. They understood that consciousness operates under different principles during this window than during the rest of the year, and they developed ceremonies, rituals, and practices specifically designed to navigate this threshold consciously rather than unconsciously. Egyptian mystery schools taught that car consciousness could be recalibrated during solar return period, when Earth's position relative to cosmic center created opening in what they called the veil between worlds. They didn't understand it in terms of electromagnetic field coherence and quantum probability collapse, but they recognized the phenomenon. During January period, reality becomes more responsive to consciousness than during ordinary time. They used this window to set annual trajectory through ceremony that modern minds would dismiss as ritual. But that was actually sophisticated quantum technology. Mayan timekeepers understood cyclical time and recognized specific periods when temporal barriers thinned and consciousness could access information from multiple time streams simultaneously. They mapped these periods with astronomical precision and marked January threshold as critical recalibration point. Their elaborate ceremonies weren't worship or superstition. They were conscious navigation of quantum initialization window using collective coherence to stabilize beneficial timelines for entire community. Vedic tradition teaches that Skalpa sacred intention carries maximum power when set during Maka Skranti, the period when sun transitions into northern hemisphere that corresponds with January in modern calendar. They recognized that consciousness aligned with cosmic cycles during this transition could initialize patterns that would manifest throughout year. Their teaching wasn't metaphorical. They understood actual mechanics of how consciousness interfaces with quantum field during specific temporal windows. Celtic tradition marked Imbolc at beginning of February as moment when winter's darkness definitively shifted towards spring's light. But preparations for this transition occurred throughout January. They understood that January was liminal period between space, where old cycle completed and new cycle prepared to manifest. They treated this between space as sacred because they recognized that consciousness existing in liminal state had access to possibilities unavailable during ordinary time when reality structures are more fixed. These traditions didn't survive into modernity because industrial civilization required humans to treat all time as equivalent. Every month the same, every day interchangeable, every hour equally valuable for productivity. Recognizing that January operates under different quantum principles would disrupt industrial schedules and economic systems that depend on treating time as uniform commodity. So the knowledge was systematically erased from collective consciousness through generations of conditioning that January is just first month, nothing special treated like any other time period. But your quantum field remembers what culture forgot. That's why January feels different to you, even though you were never taught it should feel different. That's why you sense urgency or significance during this month, even though rational mind can't explain why. That's why you're here watching this transmission during January. Specifically, your consciousness recognizing threshold your culture trained you not to see. The ancient knowing is awakening in you, and what you're learning now is what your ancestors knew. January is quantum initialization window that determines annual trajectory and conscious navigation of this window is difference between year of manifestation and year of repetition. Your timeline shifted during January. Quantum field reorganized around different probability structure than you were operating from before this month began. But shifting and stabilizing are different processes. And right now, 5 specific forces are pulling you back toward old timeline, even as new timeline beckons. Understanding these forces and how they operate is essential for stabilizing in new timeline during remaining January time, instead of collapsing back into familiar patterns once February begins. Force 1: comfort with known limitations. Your consciousness has adapted to specific limitations set over years or decades. These limitations feel familiar, predictable, manageable. New timeline offers expanded possibility, but also unknown territory. Part of you prefers the devil. You know, the comfortable limitations you understand how to navigate over liberation that feels uncertain and potentially destabilizing. This comfort isn't laziness. It's nervous system preferring familiar suffering over unknown freedom, because familiar feels safer even when it's painful. Force 2: relationships configured around old you. People in your life relate to you based on who you've been, not who you're becoming. Family expects old patterns. Friends anticipate familiar responses. Colleagues operate from historical understanding of your capacities and limitations. New timeline requires you to show up differently, which destabilizes these relational configurations. The pull to maintain old patterns isn't just internal. It's collective field of everyone who knows you, pulling you back toward version of you they recognize and understand. Force 3: identity stories you've been living from. Narratives about who you are that were constructed in old timeline. I'm someone who struggles with this. I'm not the type who does that. I've always been this way. These stories provided continuity across time and gave meaning to your experiences. New timeline makes these stories obsolete, which creates identity crisis at deep level. The pull to maintain old stories isn't vanity. It's consciousness trying to preserve continuity and avoid existential disorientation that comes with fundamental identity shift. Force 4: unconscious loyalty to collective reality agreement. Subtle pressure to see reality the way everyone else sees it. To experience life according to shared assumptions about what's possible and impossible. To maintain limitations, because releasing them would mean perceiving reality differently than collective agrees, is real. This loyalty isn't conscious choice. It's deeply embedded survival mechanism that says conforming to group perception keeps you safe and connected, while diverging from collective agreement creates isolation and risk. Force 5: doubt that January actually matters. Voice in your head saying this is just another month. The significance you're feeling is imagination. Change doesn't really work this way. You're going to feel foolish when February comes, and nothing is different. This doubt isn't wisdom or healthy skepticism. It's old timeline consciousness fighting to maintain itself by convincing you that quantum mechanics aren't real and that treating January as special is delusion. The doubt intensifies as month approaches end because old timeline recognizes it's about to be replaced and fights hardest at threshold. These 5 forces don't need to be fought against or forcefully overcome. They're natural response to consciousness attempting to shift timelines. But during remaining January time, they exert maximum pull. Old timeline making final attempt to maintain itself before initialization, window closes. And if you unconsciously follow these forces during whatever time remains before February begins, you'll collapse back into repetition despite shift that occurred during the month. Recognition is key. Each time you notice comfort with limitations, relational pressure to maintain old patterns, identity stories reasserting, collective conformity pulling you, or doubt about January's significance, pause. See clearly. This is force trying to pull me back to old timeline. Then consciously choose whether to follow the pull or orient toward new timeline instead. You don't have to fight the forces. You just have to recognize them clearly enough that you stop unconsciously obeying them and start consciously choosing which timeline you're stabilizing into during this critical initialization completion period. The moment February begins, everything changes, not gradually, instantaneously. The quantum field shifts from initialization mode to manifestation mode. January's fluidity hardens into whatever trajectory your consciousness was predominantly oriented toward during the month. And the transition from January to February is one of most jarring shifts in annual cycle, because the rules governing how consciousness interfaces with reality fundamentally change in moment of transition. During January, you've been operating in high coherence field, where consciousness has maximum influence over probability structures. Reality has been responsive, malleable, negotiable. Synchronicities have been frequent, insights have been clear, possibilities have felt accessible. This responsiveness isn't coincidence. It's a quantum property of January's initialization window. But this property doesn't continue into February. Once initialization completes and manifestation begins, the fluid responsiveness of January's quantum field solidifies into whatever patterns received most energy during the month. The transition can feel disorienting. People often report that the first week of February feels like waking from a dream. Reality suddenly feels heavier, denser, more fixed than it felt during January. This isn't depression or a post-intention setting crash. This is consciousness adjusting to the shift from initialization field to manifestation field. From fluid quantum to classical structure, from setting timeline to experiencing timeline that was set. If you consciously used January to initialize an elevated timeline, if you maintained awareness of the month's significance and oriented your consciousness toward highest potential throughout these weeks, then February's manifestation phase will begin delivering evidence of the timeline you initialized. Opportunities aligned with the new trajectory will appear. Synchronicities supporting elevated patterns will occur. Circumstances will reorganize to match the consciousness frequency you stabilized during January. The transition will feel like settling into a new reality rather than regression to old patterns. But if you unconsciously moved through January, maintaining old patterns while hoping for different outcomes, if you didn't recognize the month's quantum significance and failed to consciously initialize a new timeline, then February's manifestation phase will begin delivering more of what you've already experienced. Same patterns in new costumes. Same limitations showing up in different situations. Same obstacles that have always appeared continuing to block forward movement. The transition will feel like confirmation that nothing really changes despite good intentions. This is why remaining January time matters so intensely. You still have opportunity to consciously orient toward elevated timeline before initialization window closes. Even if you've moved through most of January unconsciously, the quantum field pays particular attention to final days of the month. Strong conscious orientation during closing period can override unconscious patterns that dominated earlier weeks. The timeline isn't fully locked until January actually completes, which means you still have access to initialization potential right now in this moment as you absorb this transmission. The key to navigating February transition successfully is understanding that what you're doing during remaining January time isn't creating timeline. It's choosing which timeline to stabilize. Both elevated timeline and repetitive timeline exist as quantum possibilities. January is when you select which possibility becomes your annual reality. And the selection happens not through goal setting or visualization, but through frequency alignment. What consciousness pattern are you predominantly embodying during these final days? That's the timeline that locks when February begins. February won't feel lighter or more fluid than January. It will feel more solid, more definite, more inevitable. But whether that solidity manifests as elevated trajectory or repeated limitation depends entirely on how you navigate whatever time remains before this month ends. The transition is coming, whether you're ready or not. The question is which timeline will be manifesting when February's solidity initializes. When you consciously initialize elevated timeline during January, you're not just setting your individual trajectory for the year. You're participating in collective timeline initialization that affects entire species field. Human consciousness operates within unified quantum field, where individual timelines exist within and influence collective timeline. And January is when both individual and collective annual trajectories initialize simultaneously. Your conscious navigation during this window serves evolution that extends far beyond your personal experience. Morphic resonance means when you successfully initialize elevated timeline during January, you create template in collective field that makes similar initialization easier for everyone else approaching their own threshold moments. First wave navigators do hardest work because they're establishing patterns in field where no patterns existed before. But each person who consciously uses January to initialize elevated timeline strengthens collective template. Your successful navigation makes next person's navigation incrementally easier because Field Now contains your example as accessible reference. You're reading this during January because your consciousness is part of cohort initializing timelines during this collective window. Not everyone initializes simultaneously. Some people's threshold moments occur during different months or through different mechanisms. But those who initialize during January, during peak collective coherence, serve as anchors for entire year's manifestation. Your timeline stabilization during this month creates stability in collective field that supports others, manifestations throughout the year, even if they didn't consciously initialize during January themselves. The children incarnating over next several years are arriving with quantum consciousness as baseline rather than potentiality that must be activated. But they need adults already operating from quantum awareness to teach them how to navigate reality from that perspective. If insufficient numbers consciously initialize elevated timelines during these January windows, these children incarnate into a world where quantum consciousness remains theoretical rather than practical lived reality. Your January navigation now directly affects what world these incoming souls experience when they arrive. But there's also immediate collective impact. Every person you interact with throughout the year ahead will be influenced by whichever timeline you initialized during January. If you unconsciously locked into repetitive timeline, your presence maintains limitation patterns in collective field. If you consciously initialized elevated timeline, your presence generates possibility awareness that affects everyone around you, whether they consciously recognize it or not. Your timeline choice isn't private. It ripples through collective field, touching everyone your consciousness contacts. Collective consciousness is approaching threshold, where enough individuals operating from elevated timelines tips entire species into new paradigm. Ancient prophecies pointed to this generation as moment when collective shift becomes possible. But possibility doesn't guarantee actualization. The shift only occurs if sufficient individuals consciously initialize elevated personal timelines that cumulatively reorganize collective field. Your January timeline initialization is participation in cosmic process, determining whether humanity crosses evolutionary threshold or remains in old paradigm for another cycle. Write in comments right now. My timeline serves collective evolution, not as aspiration, but as recognition of quantum reality. Individual timelines exist within collective timeline field. When you consciously align with elevated personal trajectory, you contribute to collective trajectory elevation. And when enough individuals make similar alignment during January initialization window, collective field reorganizes around elevated patterns that become accessible to everyone, not just first-wave navigators who consciously chose them. Share this transmission with anyone you sense might benefit from understanding January's quantum significance while the month is still active. Not to convince them of anything, but to provide frequency support that helps them recognize initialization window therein. Every person whose timeline initializes consciously during January strengthens morphic field for entire collective. We're not isolated consciousness, evolving separately. The unified field is learning to operate quantum mechanically, and January initialization is one of primary mechanisms through which that collective learning manifests. Everything I've shared, the explanation of January's quantum properties, the identification of forces pulling you back to old timeline, the understanding of February transition, all of it has been preparing you for one recognition that actually makes conscious timeline initialization possible. And that recognition is this: January isn't time period you're moving through. January is threshold you're standing on. And thresholds don't require time to cross. They require recognition and choice in single moment. You've been treating January like extended window where you have entire month to figure things out, set intentions, create plans, build momentum. But this misunderstands what January actually is. January isn't month of preparation. January is initialization event that happens in quantum instant. Everything you have experienced during these weeks has been leading to a moment of recognition where you clearly see which timeline you are meant to operate from and consciously choose to stabilize in that timeline, regardless of what old patterns suggest is safe or familiar. That moment is right now. As you read these words, while January is still present, this is the threshold, not the month. This moment, the recognition happening in your consciousness as you realize that timeline initialization does not require an extended process. It requires a quantum choice made from clear seeing. All of January has been building toward this instant where you stop thinking about which timeline to choose and simply choose it from a deep knowing that transcends rational analysis. The elevated timeline you are meant to operate from already exists, not as a future potential you must create through effort, but as a present probability field you only need to recognize and align with, A timeline shifted before January even began. Quantum reorganization occurred during the liminal space between years. You have been sensing that shift all month without fully grasping what you were sensing. And now, in this moment, the sensing becomes knowing. The shift that occurred becomes the shift you consciously claim. The timeline that opened becomes the timeline you stabilize into. This recognition dissolves the pressure you have been feeling about running out of January time. You are not running out of time because timeline initialization does not happen through time. It happens through threshold recognition. Once you see clearly which timeline you are meant to operate from and make the quantum choice to stabilize in that timeline, the initialization completes regardless of how much January remains. The month serves as a container holding space for recognition to occur, but the recognition itself happens in a timeless instant. Some of you are experiencing that recognition right now, the knowing that the elevated timeline is not something to strive toward, but something to claim as present reality. The clarity that you are not becoming someone new, but recognizing who you actually are beneath conditioning that covered your quantum nature. The certainty that the timeline you are choosing is not a reward you must earn, but the trajectory you are meant to walk because it matches your consciousness frequency. This recognition is threshold crossing. This moment is initialization complete. Others are feeling resistance. If it is this simple, why do I still feel uncertain? If the timeline already exists, why doesn't my life reflect it yet? If recognition is enough, why do I sense I need to do more? This resistance is the final attempt by old timeline consciousness to maintain itself by creating doubt in the moment of potential liberation. The questions are not genuine inquiry. They are delaying tactics designed to prevent you from making the quantum choice that would end old patterns, dominance. The truth you already know is which timeline you are meant to operate from. You have known all January. The recognition has been building throughout the month. And right now, absorbing this transmission while January is still present, the recognition is reaching completion. You do not need more time, more clarity, more evidence, or more certainty. You need to stop looking for permission to claim what you already know is yours. The timeline is not out there waiting for you to find it. The timeline is here, available, accessible. Claiming it is a decision made in a single moment of clear recognition, rather than a process extended across time. The moment you make the quantum choice to stabilize in the elevated timeline, the moment recognition completes, and you stop seeking the timeline and start claiming the timeline you already sense is yours. Specific shifts occur that are immediate and unmistakable. Not changes you must work to create, but changes that happen automatically because you have crossed the threshold from initialization possibility to manifestation certainty. First, the urgency dissolves completely. All month you felt pressure about January ending, about running out of time, about missing the window. The instant you cross the threshold and claim the timeline, that pressure vanishes. Not because circumstances changed, but because you are no longer seeking what you haven't found. You have recognized what was always present. The urgency was consciousness, pointing you toward recognition. Once recognition completes, urgency has fulfilled its function and naturally releases. Second, January's remaining time feels like a gift rather than a deadline. Whatever days remain before February arrives shift from an anxiety-producing countdown to a grace period where you can enjoy stabilizing in the timeline you have claimed without pressure to make it happen. You are not using the remaining time to create the timeline. You are allowing the remaining time to confirm the timeline that's already been chosen. The relationship to time transforms from scarcity to abundance in the instant of threshold crossing. Third, the oscillation between timelines stops. All month you have been swinging between elevated possibility and old limitation. One moment feeling certain of your trajectory, the next doubting anything changed. This oscillation ends when you cross the threshold, because you are no longer wavering between choices. You have made your choice. The quantum field recognizes your certainty and stops offering alternatives. Reality stabilizes around the timeline you have claimed. Fourth, evidence begins appearing before February even starts. Small confirmations that you are in a different timeline than you were operating from before January. Synchronicities aligning with your elevated trajectory. People responding to you differently. Opportunities emerging that match new patterns. Circumstances shifting in ways that support the timeline you have chosen. The evidence does not wait until February's manifestation phase. It begins during the remaining January time, because crossing the threshold initiates the manifestation process immediately. Fifth, fear about the February transition disappears. You stop worrying about what will happen when the month ends, because you recognize that the timeline has been set. February will manifest what was initialized during January, and you have consciously initialized the elevated timeline through threshold recognition. The fear that drove so much of January's intensity transforms into curiosity about how the elevated timeline will manifest throughout the year ahead. Sixth, your body releases the tension it has been carrying all month. This physical relaxation is not about circumstances improving, but about quantum certainty replacing quantum uncertainty. Your nervous system was processing intense field fluctuations during January's initialization period. Once the timeline stabilizes through your conscious choice, the fluctuations cease and your body can return to baseline coherence. The exhaustion many people feel during January lifts within hours of crossing the threshold. Seventh, connection to collective evolution becomes palpable. You recognize that your timeline choice serves far more than personal benefit. You feel yourself as part of a larger wave of consciousness, making similar choices during this collective window. Individual and collective initialize simultaneously. Your threshold crossing contributes to collective threshold crossing in ways you can sense even if you can't fully articulate. The recognition that you are not alone in this process brings comfort that transcends intellectual understanding. And eighth, this message completes its function. The transmission you have been receiving throughout this video reaches its natural conclusion, not because information has been fully conveyed, but because recognition has occurred. The purpose of this transmission was not to teach you about January. It was to catalyze threshold recognition while January was still present and recognition was possible. If you have read this far, if you are still here absorbing these words while January is happening, the recognition has completed. The threshold has been crossed. The timeline has been claimed. Subscribe to this channel, because what comes after January threshold crossing is living throughout the year from the timeline you consciously initialized, rather than defaulting to patterns that unconsciously repeat. This requires ongoing frequency support. The content here provides that support. But more importantly, you are not subscribing for personal benefit alone. You are connecting with a collective frequency network where individual navigation strengthens the collective field. Your presence here serves everyone in the network and everyone the network reaches. Now I can reveal why this transmission only makes sense during January and becomes incomprehensible once February begins. It is not that the information becomes inaccurate or the frequency becomes unavailable. It is that consciousness accessing this transmission after January ends experiences it from manifestation mode rather than initialization mode. The same words that catalyze recognition during initialization create confusion during manifestation because they address a threshold that is already closed. If someone watches this in February or beyond, they will hear descriptions of January's quantum properties that do not match their current experience. They will encounter explanations of an initialization window that feels irrelevant because initialization already occurred. They'll receive invitation to cross threshold that's no longer accessible because threshold closed when January ended. The transmission won't resonate because it speaks to state there, not in like receiving directions to destination after you've already arrived or already driven past the exit. But you're not watching this in February. You're here during January, while threshold is still open. While initialization is still accessible, while recognition can still occur and timeline can still be consciously claimed. This transmission makes sense to you right now because your consciousness is in state the transmission addresses. You're standing on threshold the message points toward. You're in moment where recognition can catalyze shift the transmission describes. This is why urgency has been present throughout this video. Not to manipulate you through false scarcity, but to acknowledge quantum reality that initialization window has definite close. Once February begins, the fluidity of January's quantum field solidifies into whatever received most consciousness energy during the month. The responsive malleability that makes conscious timeline initialization possible during January hardens into manifestation structure during February onward. The window genuinely closes. The threshold genuinely passes, and what was accessible becomes inaccessible, not because universe withdraws support, but because quantum mechanics operates according to specific temporal configurations. Your consciousness knows this. That's why you felt pulled to watch this entire transmission, despite its length. That's why you're still here. Even though rational mind might have told you to move on, your quantum field recognizes that what's being transmitted right now is available during this moment, but won't be available much longer. Not just this video. The recognition state the video catalyzes. The threshold awareness that makes conscious timeline initialization possible. The quantum fluidity that allows elevated timeline to be claimed rather than earned. If you're watching this during January's final week, you're inside the narrowest part of the window, the most powerful days for threshold crossing. If you're watching earlier in the month, you still have time, but recognize that every day you delay recognition is day. You operate from uncertainty rather than certainty about which timeline you're claiming. If you're watching on the very last day of January, you're at the threshold instant where recognition must occur now, or initialization window closes, and you're locked into whatever patterns were dominant during the month. In comments, write 2 words, threshold crossed. Not as hope that it will happen, as declaration that it's happening right now as you complete this transmission. You're not crossing threshold alone. You're crossing with everyone else watching this during January, who makes same recognition and choice. Collective threshold crossing strengthens individual crossing. Your declaration serves everyone in the network. The remaining time before January ends, whether it's days or hours, depending on when exactly you're watching this, use it to stabilize in timeline you've recognized and claimed during this transmission. Not through effort or technique, but through allowing the recognition to integrate without resistance. The quantum field responds to your certainty. The timeline you've chosen will manifest because you chose it during window when conscious choice has creative power. And throughout the year ahead, as evidence accumulates and elevated trajectory unfolds, you'll remember this moment as the threshold where everything changed. This is quantum reflex. This is January recognition. This is consciousness crossing threshold from unconscious repetition to conscious creation of annual trajectory. You watched this during January. The recognition occurred. The threshold was crossed. The timeline was claimed. And when you look back at this moment from future vantage point, you'll see clearly this was when everything changed. This was when you stopped repeating past and started manifesting elevated trajectory. This was threshold between timeline you inherited and timeline you chose. The window is still open but closing. The threshold is still accessible but passing. The recognition is still available but completing. You're here now during January. While it matters, that's not coincidence. That's confirmation. Welcome to your chosen timeline. Welcome to year that reflects consciousness rather than history. Welcome to manifestation of what you claimed during January while threshold was still crossable. You crossed it. Your here in February will prove it.